I believe, I'm fairly certain, popcorn starts in the movies in the 30s. And because it's the Great Depression, right? And so it was a way of theater owners to make a little bit of money. And popcorn was such a good thing to make and sell because it basically returned a 300% profit. It was very, very cheap to buy and to make, and you could sell it for. And then, as you all know, sell it for much more. And as you know, when you eat popcorn, you get thirsty. And so it had that added benefit of the necessity to also have a beverage. So concessions started movies in the 1930s. It'd be really fun. I don't know if you've ever done a 1930s kind of day at the movies in your library, but to do food and the kind of program that would have been around in the 30s. And also there were games to lure people into theaters, different kind of raffle-y sorts of things and giveaways. And the 30s was fun at the movies. Also double feature, so you got two for the price of one. But back to World War I, where actually by 1917, when America enters the war, the movies are really already relatively popular among moviegoers, among people like us, and also as an industry, the business of movie making and distributing and exhibiting was also pretty well established. And so what I want to do tonight, I hope, is to kind of give you sort of a sense of what it was like to be on the home front in 1917 and 18, and what role movies might have played in your life then, what you would have expected from movies, what you would have, what the experience of going to the movies might have been like. So that from the ground up. And then I also want to kind of make suggestions about what the government thought about the movies at this point in time too. So what at like another level was the expectation for movies and movie going? Why did the government, in other words, think the film industry would be a good partner for them, which is what happened. So we're going to kind of be looking at it from our point of view as moviegoers, and also from the government point of view as an entity needing to be able to communicate, and then from the industry point of view, trying to answer the question, why was it in their best interest also to work with the government at the same time they're trying to continue to grow their business. What you're seeing right now are 3 glass slides, or pictures, images of glass slides. And I brought a real one in case anybody is just kind of interested in this technology. Before movie pictures, that as we know them, if you wanted a kind of entertainment that was similar to projected images, what you could go to see were magic lantern shows. And what magic lanterns used, they were kind of like projectors that were run on, I'm not exactly sure what kind of a light source it was. I'll get it wrong if I try to say it. But there were carousel or slide holders, and there would be multiple slides, and so the slides would go in and out in front of the lens, and you could tell Bible stories that way, you could do travelogues that way, you could tell the stories of Shakespearean plays that way. By the time of World War I, individual slides were used for advertising purposes. And so audiences going to the theaters, just like we go now and you see ads for local businesses generally, you could have also seen ads for different kinds of things. So when the war starts, the government also makes use of that custom that was, again, already in place. So you could, they could put their help wanted ad up, or the Save Your Old Clothes for the Red Cross week, or reminding you that your income taxes were due, and where you got the forms to fill those out. So again, the other thing to think about as you look at this is, as you're sitting in the movie theater and say one of these slides comes up, also just kind of imagine, no matter what it was you're going to see, what kind of a movie, if you're going to see a Western or a comedy or a drama or a melodrama, you know, something with nothing connected to the war about it at all, you might begin that whole experience seeing a slide reminding you that, in fact, there is a war on and your help is needed. So even though you're here to relax and have fun and be entertained, out in the real world, which isn't all that far away, you know, we need your help. We need your help. So you never really escaped the war by going to the movies. And I think you'll sort of see that in action as I go through some of the other pictures I want to show you. So, next please. Woodrow Wilson, who was the president at the time, was also keen on movies. So in June of 1917, again, just a few months after we entered the war in April, he says, the film has come to rank as a very high medium for the dissemination of public intelligence, which was what they called propaganda then, which wasn't a dirty word then. And since it speaks a universal language, it lends itself importantly to the presentation of America's plans and purposes. So you can see that, really relatively early in the war, from the top of our government, we're getting this kind of public declaration that film is okay. It's respectable. It's an industry that we want and that we need, and that it can really help us to win this war. And so the government also was quite, as we'll see, quite kind of invested in the sense, the notion of propaganda kind of appears after World War I, sort of as a result of what happens during World War I. But the government clearly was interested in using the film industry as a mode of communication of its plans and purposes, of the things that needed the United States, people in the United States to know. It was also the case that by 1917, the film industry was in the position to aid the government. It's a national industry. So movies begin to be projected, in screenings in 1894, and the industry grew really relatively rapidly. So by 1917, it was already partially vertically integrated. So the three branches of the film industry are film production, the making of the movies, film distribution, getting them from point A to point C, and exhibition. Okay, and so by 1917, film producers were already owning film distributors, and so it was certainly a national industry. In 1917, it was both in New York City, but also in Hollywood. It kind of moved out to Hollywood beginning in about 1913, but films are still being made in both places, and it had national reach. It was an industry that was supported by a professional infrastructure, so that if you were a movie theater manager, you had access to professional trade journals that were telling you basically what best practices were. And it was run by immigrants, basically, the film industry, who were ambitious and good storytellers and turned out to be very good businessmen, mainly men. So, next slide. It wasn't only Washington, D.C., though, that thought movies were an appropriate pastime for people and also a useful pastime. So what I'd like to read you is just a little bit from an editorial that was published in the Stevens Point Journal. I'm from Stevens Point, so a lot of my examples are from Point, but the industry really was national, and so it's possible that Waupaca had a similar kind of editorial and had a movie theater at that point called The Lyric. And so a lot of what I'm going to be talking about that's happening in Stevens Point happened in other places and most likely here as well. And as I read, you can look at some of these old pictures of theaters. So this is called Amusements in Wartime. There was a little bit of a debate right at the beginning of American entry into the war about whether it was okay to be entertained. This is such a serious time. Was it okay to go to a comedy? Should movies all be about the war? Should they just be documentary? How should we respond to this? And here's what the editorial writers at the Point Journal said. The State Council of Defense makes an appeal to local authorities to bar carnivals in time of war. It says that there is always criticism of traveling shows of doubtful character, and in view of the state and national campaigns for economy, it's absurd to encourage these wasteful organizations merely for the sake of the amusement which they furnish. In place of carnivals, it favors the State Council of Defense, community picnics, fairs, chautauquas, home talent entertainments. They contain, it says, all the benefits and none of the evils of the traveling show. Then the editorial goes on. The The State Council of Defense, though, overlooks the most popular and the cheapest form of amusement, the moving picture show. When the war began and everybody was bursting with advice he wished to impart to the public for the proper conduct of the country at this critical time, there were many, many thoughtless suggestions that the moving picture houses should be closed during war. An effort was made to develop a hue and cry against them. Fortunately, it failed. People must have entertainment, even in the midst of the war. And right in the trenches, German, British, and French soldiers are given tableaus, music, and moving pictures. And nowhere can they get it so cheap and considering its cheapness so well as from moving pictures. Stevens Point has many good picture houses. Actually, there were 4 at this point, which give people clean, wholesome amusement and often education at a trifling price. The moving picture ranks with the automobile as among the great growths of the 20th century, which have contributed most to the pleasure of living. To close the picture houses in wartime would be to drive people to amusement places which would be worse for them. Think pool halls or those traveling carnivals. Patronized with judgment, the best of things, even the habit of book reading, can be turned into a dissipation. They are a public boon. So, but as for the traveling carnival, he says, the quicker it's ended, the better. So again, if you kind of think about this in context, as an editorial in a city newspaper, one of 2 city newspapers in Stevens Point, the other kind of principle underlying this point of view is that these are important businesses in our community, and we need to support them, and they are good, helpful businesses. And I think to rank it with the automobile is also very telling. Moving pictures were seen as, this great technological advance of the 20th century. And so you can see, by 1915, there are some actually rather astoundingly beautiful movie theaters in our state, and the Ringling Theater in Baraboo is still up and running. The Lyric Theater in Stevens Point exists no more. I'm not sure about the Rex in Oshkosh. The other picture, and as you can see also, these are purpose-built theaters. They're theaters that were built to show movies. And that begins to be the case by 1907, 1908. So the term Nickelodeon really means a theater that was built to show movies that cost a nickel. And so those were the very first purpose-built theaters, but they were really mainly just storefronts with chairs and a projector in them. Nothing very fancy. But by about 1913, you begin to have, very nice moving picture theaters, and in some cases what were called picture palaces, neat theaters and big ones. In Stevens Point, a new theater opens in 1916 that seats 600 people, just to let you know. And the other theater in town, I think, sat at least 300. And I would imagine the Lyric might have been 200 or 300 too, if it's the only game in town. So, so again, this is a thriving business. People are investing in properties like this. And so, again, it also tells you something about the respectability of movies, the popularity of movies, and the bet that this is going to be, this art form, popular art form, is going to be around for a while. The image right here is from a scrapbook that was made by a girl at a teacher's college in Pennsylvania in 1917. She graduates in 1917. And on one page of her scrapbook, where she's got all this other stuff too, including programs from plays she goes to, old report cards, labels from stationery that she's bought. She included this ad for the Idle Hour Theater. And a picture of Mary Pickford, and it's Mary Pickford who's starring in Good Little Rich Girl. Some of you may know that either novel, or I think there was a Shirley Temple movie, I think, too. And if you'll notice what she's written at the side of that is those movies every Saturday afternoon. It's really the only reference she makes to movies in this big scrapbook of kind of her life at school that year. But she really doesn't need to say anymore. This is what she and her friends did on a Saturday afternoon in Westchester, Pennsylvania. So it was very much a kind of an ordinary, acceptable thing for even young, unaccompanied girls to do at this point in time. So next slide, please. Okay. It wasn't only the government, though, and the film industry that thought they really had something in the movie, something useful. By 1917, actually by 1914, the advertising industry was also kind of up and running, and they had realized, round about this time too, that movies and movie stars could help them sell stuff, and were really influential. So here's just a couple of examples of Irene Castle. Some of you may know, she was part of the famous dancing duo, Irene and Vernon Castle. Her husband, Vernon, dies tragically in the war. But she goes on to make movies as well as dance. She sold everything. Advertisers used her, in this case, to sell silk. She sold china. She sold silverware. There was a lot of Irene Castle branded material. Billie Burke, who you know as the Good Witch Glendon, the Wizard of Oz, she was in the movies in the teens. She got married, and when she got married, Charles Frohman, who she had worked for in the theater business, got angry with her because it was better for her to be young and single and adorably attractive. And if you're married, you're not quite so available. And he thought it was bad public relations, and she got mad and went on a trip west and went to California. And Thomas Ince, a famous film producer, kind of nabbed her, and she started making movies. And she worked really solidly pretty much throughout her entire life. She would go back and forth with theater a little bit, but mainly she made movies. Here you can buy, she was very famous in her theater career before she goes into movies for wearing pajamas, which were, you know, basically a nightgown with legs in them. But she wore men's clothes a lot, and it was seen as just, you know, this really cute thing because she was clearly not a guy. She was clearly a girl, and so isn't it funny that this girl was wearing pants? But anyway, so she sold pajamas. Mary Pickford sells face cream and a whole lot more than that. She also sold shoes. She's actually the first actress that I found that was used to give testimonials in advertising. And as you can see at the bottom of this ad for Pompeian night cream, which will help you look beautiful even in wartime when your face might get a little bit dry because you're so worried. You could send off for a calendar. And I'm not sure where, these must have been, so this is like this. And it must have been like something you could pick up at the drugstore. And on the back page is the clip-on coupon, and you send it in with a dime, and you got this full length. So you could bring Mary Pickford into your house, in other words, for not very much money. And, you know, again, thinking about why advertisers are doing this, they think that women, in this case, will be drawn to these images and then maybe to their products. And then you think about it again from our point of view. Why would I think why would I let Mary Pickford sell me something? Maybe I want to look like that too, or you know, maybe there's something. What is there about stars already at this point in time that would, you know, make, again, men mostly in this booming advertising industry think movie stars are going to be successful, and they get used in testimonial advertising, you know, ever since. So, okay. So next slide, please. Okay. So the kind of concept that I think really helps to describe the way that the film industry and the government work together. Just a second, I'm going to maneuver myself here. Is practical patriotism. So I hope it's kind of clear what industry, like the government and the advertising industry, thought they could, the ways that they thought that the film industry could be of help to them by spreading its message, by already having proved itself to be popular with people and of influence on people, ordinary people, all across the United States. But what did the film industry have to gain from this? You know, why go along with the government? And in fact, what the film industry did was be proactive. They didn't wait for the government to come to them to ask for help. In fact, by June of 1917, the main leaders in the American film industry had gone to Washington and offered the services of the film industry. themselves, and the industry agreed. And the result was that some of the main executives in the American film industry were assigned to the main departments and branches of the government in Washington. So the U.S. Food Administration, the Treasury Department, and assorted other of the departments. The film industry had a lot to gain, actually, by cooperation with the government. One was they were sort of being proactive out of nervousness. Because as you can tell in this editorial, there were some people who said, this is frivolity, close these movie theaters down, we're at war, we need to be serious. Film industry did not want anything closed down, right? They're building theaters, they've set up distribution networks across the United States. They're paying these movie stars quite a bit of money already by 1917. So number one, they really wanted the goodwill of the government and the goodwill of the people. And by cooperating, they got that. Secondly, they were worried about censorship. As the film industry is developing throughout the aughts and the early 19-teens, again, you've got kind of a national industry, and what was happening was in some states, there would be state censors who would object to particular parts of particular movies. So what would fly in Illinois might get into trouble in Kentucky, and it was really a hassle. Again, you're imagining this industry that needs to rely on getting movies from theater to theater, from state to state. It's doing things at a national level. It's just really inefficient if states and localities within states can, sort of nip and tuck, depending on the local sort of beliefs about, goodness and badness. So they were really concerned about censorship, and again, the thought is that the more cooperation they give to the government, the less danger they're going to run into if push ever comes to shove. And then, okay, so here's an example of one of the ways that the film industry did cooperate. They created, again, glass slides for the Food Administration. And so one of the ways that people could help out the government in the war was by not using meat and not using flour and not eating so much meat, so that then those things could go to the troops. And again, so they would, so this is like a five slide set where, that you begin with be patriotic, and the female figure is in that same pose, right, that we'll be seeing as we go through some of these other slides, appealing directly to us. And then we learned that Mrs. Wilson signed the food pledge card drive, and there you see it if you didn't believe it. And the four great problems in the war are food, men, money, and ships, and we need our help to win in all those ways. And you should substitute fish for meat and corn for wheat. So you get a lot of information, you know what you're supposed to do. There literally was a pledge card that you signed, and then you displayed in your house. So these would be distributed through post offices. So again, through the State Council of Defense, down through the post offices in different localities, and then to the movie theaters, and then they would show in movie theaters. Again, think about what the government, how they thought they were getting their message across, again, in these days before radio, clearly before television. There were lots of newspapers in lots of places. But you had to be literate to read newspapers. Actually, you have to be literate to read these cards, but maybe somebody at the movies was talking to you if you couldn't have read that. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, they also really prominently helped to sell government war bonds, which was one of the ways that the United States supported the war or paid for the war. And here, if you remember back to the slide of movie stars selling face cream and silk and pajamas, here you just have them selling something different, right? So they've already established their bona fides as being able to sell anything. Now the government's using it to sell war bonds. And these are the biggest stars of the day. So Charlie Chaplin, William S. Hart, who was a cowboy star, and his horse Fritz. William S. Hart was particularly popular in smaller places. In Stevens Point, he's really big. You can see a William S. Hart movie, virtually every month. This is Rita Jolivet. She was on the Lusitania. She was one of the survivors. And so she comes back from that tragedy and is a really good salesman for bonds. And here I think is my favorite picture because it's got kind of this wonderful combination. Marie Dressler, who you may know from movies from the 30s, Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, but then FDR, and the guy up above Mary Pickford's head is Herbert Hoover. And then I don't know who the military men are, but this is also at a Liberty Loan Drive rally. You know, so here you have politicians and you have movie stars, and they're in close proximity to each other. You know, so again, movie stars are movie stars, and they were then, and politicians are drawn to this light, and they're working together. When the war ends, William McAdoo, who was the son-in-law of Woodrow Wilson, becomes the lawyer for Pickford, Fairbanks, Chaplin, and D.W. Griffith when they form United Artists in 1919. And Will Hayes, who was the head of the Republican Party and also Postmaster General right after the war, he goes to Hollywood in the early 1920s and is the head of basically their public relations organization. So the war brought politicians together with stars and others in the film industry, and it did pay off for the industry after the war. It also raised a whole lot of money during the war. Okay. Okay, now I'm going to show you something, so you'll get to see what these movies looked like. In addition to speaking at Bond rallies, another way that the film industry cooperated with the government was by making short films, and they did this for the Fourth Liberty Loan. The one you'll see tonight is about 14 minutes. Again, the biggest stars in the industry made these, and they were of all sorts. The one you're going to see is like a short story, a short narrative film, starring Mary Pickford. And as you watch it, what I'd like you to notice are a couple of things. One, like if Charlie Chaplin was maybe the most popular male movie star, Mary Pickford was absolutely hands down the most popular female movie star. And it was during World War I that her nickname of America's Sweetheart came to be kind of attached to her. And the movie itself is called 100% American. So you've got 100% American starring America's Sweetheart. And so it's interesting as you watch it to think about what does American mean, right? Who are we supposed to be, you know, what are we watching? What are the traits that make her our sweetheart and 100% American? And I think actually it's a little bit surprising, I think. It may not be exactly what you think. And we can talk about it afterwards at the end of tonight if you want to. So watch for that. Watch for kind of her character and personality. It's shot in New York. I think we see Coney Island. I'm not exactly sure, but I think that's where this is set. So but at any rate, it's shot on the streets. So you get to see what New York looks like in 1917, which is another, for me, just real appeal of these old movies. You get to see what people, you know, looked like, what places looked like, what clothes looked like. And Mary Pickford plays kind of a shop girl, I think. But at one point, you get sort of a close-up of her shoes. And so it's clear that, you know, she's a fashionable shop girl. And then you'll see the kind of dilemmas that she faces in this movie. But all of the Liberty Loan films were basically propaganda pieces urging us to buy Liberty Loans. So we want to go from there. I think you'll find that it looks a lot like movies look today. By 1917, the editing strategies that we know, shot reverse shot, moving camera getting closer to characters, they were in place. Narrative continuity, you know, how one thing follows another and makes sense, also in place. The lighting is going to look like, you know, we're familiar with. There's no talking. Well, people move their mouths, right? But it's music. You'll also hear quite a good accompaniment. And so as you listen to the movie, you'll hear snippets from popular songs, popular war songs, and also just contemporary songs of the time. And I think the music track is really quite typical of the way that movies sounded then too. Are the lights? Thank you. So instead of words, a lot of information and humor comes through in the intertitles. Okay, and so that I think you get a really good sense of the kind of star persona she had and what movies at the time looked like. So great. So these are all the movies Mary Pickford made during 1917 and 18, and it's a lot of films. Actors worked hard then. The two in blue, Little American and Joanna and Liz, those are the only two movies she made that were war-related. Okay? So all the others, again, some titles you might recognize, Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm, A Little Princess. Stella Maris is also based on a novel. Melissa was a short story. How Could Eugene, and others. They had no narrative relationship to the war at all. And Mary Pickford's filmography during the war is very typical of the productions or the films created during World War I. Only about 20% of the movies shown during World War I told war stories. And I think the kind of cliche is that once the war starts, we're only making war films, and they're all kind of hate the Hun, terrible Kaiser sort of movies. I have a slide a little bit later with one of the titles was The Kaiser, the Beast of Berlin, and there was The Prussian Cur, and there was To Hell with the Kaiser. So there were those kind of movies made. For the most part, they were not made until about March of 1918. So the war's just about over by the time the really truly anti-German films come out. And for the most part, if you went to the movies during 1917 and 18, you saw the same kind of movies you would have seen before the war and then after the war. Comedies and westerns and melodramas and dramas. Here, and again, let me just talk for a second about the other pictures that I've got here. But Mary Pickford didn't just sell war bonds. She adopted an infantry troop in California and gave them like a kind of a goodie packet to take overseas with them that included cigarettes and stuff. And she threw parties for them. And then she knitted, you know, as other stars did, knitted for the war cause. She's dressed in the top in the headdress of the Red Cross. So she was also lending her name and her influence to their fundraising cause. You know, so even though mostly she's not making war films, she's still, you know, really pretty much connected to the war too. You know, so again, even if you're going to see Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm, a movie that has absolutely nothing to do about the war, you might, when you sit down in the theater, first see slides telling you to eat corn and not wheat. You would know because you might look at popular magazines, not film magazines necessarily, Ladies' Home Journal. You know, that she was involved in all these causes. Also, there were movie pages in newspapers that would have talked about those kinds of things. You know, so you knew kind of who she was, and you knew the kinds of movies she starred in, the kind of characters she often played. And then in real life, she's doing very similar things. She's young, and she's spunky, and she's energetic, and she's, you know, self-sacrificing for a good cause, as we saw her in 100% American. Okay. And then other stars too. So in the top corner is Theda Bara, who never played a good woman. She was always the evil woman in movies. She was always stealing people's husbands if she didn't just kill them outright. But there she is talking to soldiers. You know, so that was a little bit more of a public relations stretch. You had to make Theda Bara good in real life and still let her be bad in the movies. Billy Burke is wearing the uniform of the Food Administration, and I have a postcard of, you know, basically Billy Burke in the Food Administration. You know, so again, people that really were into movie stars could collect these sorts of things, and you could send your friends movie star postcards if you wanted to spend your money on them. That would probably be a profligate thing to do. Elsie Janis actually quit work for the duration of the war and entertained the troops. She's really a remarkable young woman. And then we have Edith Story knitting for her brother while she's starring in the movie called The Legion of Death, which is about the Russian Revolution. You know, so again, the relationship between the publicity that stars were getting for their war work was kind of one category, again, aimed to create goodwill among their audiences. But the movies they made, for the most part, were not war-related. And if you think about it from the film industry point of view, it makes some sense. Number one, we were a country that had a lot of an estate, if we just even stay in Wisconsin, a state with many, many German immigrants. And so, you know, while we're at war with that country, there's citizens in this country that were conflicted. And so you don't want to, you know, alienate these potential moviegoers. So the industry was worried for a long time about, you know, whether that would put people off, whether they would be able to sell those films. Also, films were exported abroad. And so after the war, the film industry isn't only looking at now, they're looking at later. And after the war, you need to be able to export movies again. And, you know, again, so you may not, they were very careful. It also took about 6 months to make a film. So you couldn't have jumped right in immediately and made war-related movies either. It would have been more difficult. And so again, the more war-related films come out really much later in the war. But even then, it's never more than 20% of what's on offer. So that's just the case. Okay, next slide, please. And okay, now if you could like find, yeah. Yes, please. So as we're sort of setting up the next thing, in Madison this year on Armistice Day, on November 11th, a group of musicians got together and created this, what they called a rock and roll history of World War I. That's really a remarkable thing. I'm not sure it's ever going to get to go on the road or be shown again. They're talking to Wisconsin Public Television. So if you kind of watch your Wisconsin Public Television guides, they may be doing a couple of shows of the 30-minute concert. I think that's the name of it, something like that, that's going to play some of their songs. But I wanted to play just a couple of their songs for you. They're not film-related, but the first one is about a nurse, basically, who was from Madison. Helen, her name was Helen Volovsky. And she goes off to war, and one of the songwriters for this program, Ken Fitzsimmons, had access to her letters and diaries, and used her words and set them to music. And then also in her diaries, Bukowski copied in poems that were meaningful to her and that kind of gave her a way of thinking about the world and a way of a kind of guidance for living her life. And so those also are in that. It's followed up by a song called She Works on Cars. And so we've seen movie stars do all these things for the war effort, very homely kinds of things. But women in World War I actually did lots of other sorts of work too. And there were and movie stars were kind of shown doing some of that, but not so much because they were movie stars and had their movies to make. But I think it's a really good kind of reminder for us here of what was actually going on at the home front at the time. So we'll watch these two songs and then come back to the movies, please. Yeah.
I want with all my heart. In this great war to play my part, oh, I am others. Now I am a nurse. I'll leave my home of Madison. All the parades and bands urging us to go to We finally found real love. This is what we came here for. My father truly is. This one is bleeding us. What's got his love? He's gone. But still I carry on. Tis just what you are and do. Second to the world, the best that you have, and the best will come back to you. And the best will come back to you. Thanks so much, ladies and gentlemen. There's a few members of the Waupaca family here today. So many of us are familiar with the image
And actually, what happened was she said, you should listen to this podcast before you write this up. So I did. And we had many conversations. And so on a camping trip, I made lists of, I took a list of pictures of all the things at the exhibit, and I made lists of all the things that we were doing there at home, overseas, and then listened to the podcast and some thought, and actually listened to this invisible work. And so it's not enough to just thank Maggie for her support, because really she's like a co-writer of this song and much of this material. And so I want to recognize all the women in the house and in the world for their physical work, and especially for their And this was what we came up with. This was called She Works on Cars. Let me tell you about someone recently brought to my attention who was always there. She was always there. And you might be surprised a man is wondering what a woman does in her day, but he needs to see. That's the point, you see, that in 1918, this is what he might see. She works on cars, takes her back into the bar, the drawbridge high, the bus was staying high, the locomotive neck. She walks along the track, she's the section
So those women would then go to movies at night, right? I mean, so I think it's also, if you think about people putting in long days at work, women and men, and as we'll see in a minute, also children, and then in the nighttime they go to movies. So again, I think the notion that you ever escape anything by going to the movies is just not really very accurate, and I don't think it was accurate during World War I. So we've talked a lot about film producers, and what I'd like to kind of close out tonight with is talking about film exhibitors and the way they helped with enlisting in the war effort too. So I think we've seen up to this point that mostly what the film industry did was not really to disturb their business very much. They needed, in order to grow, expand, make a profit, they needed to keep doing what they had been doing so successfully. And kind of around the edges, they figured out ways they could help. They made short films, they could show along with features, they lent their stars to these causes. They did those sorts of things. Film exhibitors, movie theater managers, like the Lyric in town, did the same thing. They pretty much kept showing movies like they always had, but with a few differences. So the two yellowy-looking ads are from Stevens Point paper. And what you'll see is the Gem Theater one night had a benefit for the local cavalry troop, and then showed, basically war-related documentary kind of films. But your part of your price of admission would be going to that show. You can also see that it costs between 10 and 25 cents to go to the movies, so you get a sense of the value for money. There would have been live music playing, so there would have been that going on too. You would have been there with your friends, possibly in the new 16-seat theater in town, or 600-seat theater in town. The second was the Christmas matinee of Life of the Savior in natural colors. But you'll notice also that a percentage of the gross receipts for this movie are donated to the Red Cross. So again, if you think about it from the theater manager's point of view, the war becomes another way to get people into the movies. Again, this is not a frivolous activity you're doing. Come to the movies, see the beautiful life of our Savior in color, and also part of your price of admission goes to help this worthy cause. So, if you were feeling a little bit like, oh, should I save my money to buy a bond? They're saying, no, don't worry about that. Come on and we'll help the Red Cross. Peach pits are part of, I'm not sure which part of the peach pit, if it was the shell or the kernel inside the shell, were ground up and used in gas masks to help filter for the gas that was used in war. And here we've got some Girl Scouts in Washington, D.C. collecting peach pits. I couldn't actually find one of a movie theater, but movie theaters also would have what they called peach pit matinees, where you brought in, I guess, peach pits you'd saved up over however many time in season that you'd been eating your peaches, and then you got free admission or just doing a good deed. But the Nassau Theater on Long Island gave a weekly pass to any youngster, it says, who will come to the box office with 5 pounds of peach stones. And again, so this was around the country, and there are other pictures of people with peach pits. So peach pit matinees, benefits for local troops, benefits for the Red Cross. And the next slide, please. And this is, again, an ad for Stevens Point. And here you do see one of the kind of hate the Hun sorts of movies. To hell with the Kaiser, no mistake about it. But at first you're supposed to buy bonds. So buy more bonds, and then to hell with the Kaiser, too. Yep. Okay. The other way film exhibitors helped the war was by allowing this group called 4-Minute Men to speak from their stages. And the 4-Minute Man organization, again, was national in scope. It was under the auspices of what was called the Committee on Public Information that was headed by a man named George Creel. And this is kind of where it was where the governmental propaganda, it was the propaganda arm of the government during World War I. And Creel was a journalist who believed that he was providing information. Again, people, from my research, there really is not cynicism of the kind that we're more familiar with during World War I. People in the film industry both thought they were helping the war effort, which they wanted to do, and also that they were helping themselves. And those two things were compatible. And Creel, I think, was operating kind of from a similar sort of point of view. So the 4 Minutemen, from kind of a centralized office in Washington, a department created topics, they created talking points, and they created what they called the budget of agenda, which was, basically facts you could use in your speech. And then at the local level within every state, kind of at the county level, it seems like to me, local 4 Minutemen organizations would be formed. And then later in the war, women got to be 4-minute women, and then later, even in the war, children got to be 4-minute speakers. And then there was 4-minute singing, but more about that later. And as we'll see in a second, it was the most prominent men in town who got to be 4-minute men. And again, you get the kind of sense of the respect with which theaters and the film industry was held. You've done a great deal, as it is, in acquainting patrons of theaters with the merits of various American propositions, and now theaters are going to be allowing 4-minute people to speak. So next slide. And here's some of the topics. So it was really a range of things, and sometimes these speeches would come before the movie started. Film was shown on reels then, and you had to change reels as you showed feature films, which were longer than 1 reel. There were 5 reels sometimes. And so the anecdote is that 4 minutes was about the time it took to change reels in a movie theater. I'm not sure I think it's an anecdote. But at any rate, it's a limited amount. You are absolutely not allowed to go over that. Sometimes in the middle of a screening, but mostly at the beginning and the end of a screening, the 4-minute man would get up and talk on one of those speeches. And just for an example, in the week of June 18th in 1917, and I'm not sure if it's this Red Cross, but it must be that Red Cross campaign, the raising money for the Red Cross. In my area anyway, in Stevens Point, at the 2 theaters, in these 7 days, 15 speeches were given to roughly 2,520 people. And there were 6 speeches given at other locations to 300 people during that time. So, they really did. It was kind of like this was the radio sort of the day. And so across the United States, people in movie theaters would be hearing maybe put together in sort of a little bit different package, but the same facts, the same topic, and basically getting the same point. Just for your information, what was showing at the movies that week were a Mary Pickford film called Pride of the Clan, where Mary Pickford is a spunky Scottish girl who basically saves her village. There was another film called The Vixen, starring Theda Bara, and make up the story to go with that title. There was Little Lady Eileen, about a young woman in Ireland who believes in fairies, and she gets forced to marry a man she doesn't love, and the fairies knock him off his horse and kill him, which is handy, and then she gets to marry the guy that she loves. There was one called The Trufflers, which was about kind of hypocrites, basically. So again, movies that are just, movies. They're not war stories. But nevertheless, your movie either gets begun, ended, or interrupted by somebody telling you to give more money to the Red Cross. In Stevens Point, at any rate, and this was, I think, true of other locations, the 4-minute men were made up of 2 former mayors, lawyers, bankers, professors, businessmen, and the superintendent of schools, who had the most wonderful name of Lancelot Gordon. So you were being told, given this information, or to pass on to people or to persuade people, by the people in town that you thought the most highly of, and teaching your children, running your banks, taking care of your money. A lot of times pastors were also part of, pastors and ministers were 4-minute people. And again, thinking about it from the theater owner's point of view, you put the most prominent people in town on the stage of your theater, and if that's not sending the message that, it's okay to come to movies, and in fact you should, because look who else is here. So it's working both ways. The government's message is being delivered by a credible source, and the industry and the locality are benefiting. Everybody's benefiting at this point. Okay, next. And as I said, there was 4 minutes singing across the United States. And this would happen before the movie started. So films were kind of shown in programs. So you might start out with a slideshow, say about saving wheat. You might have a short newsreel. You might have a short comedy, and then you would have a feature film, which would be anywhere from 50 minutes to an hour and a half. Some movies were even longer than that. So it was kind of this whole 2-hour sort of package of entertainment. And so one of the songs you could have sung along with was Sweet Dolly Gray. But I would like you to help me sing along with Over There, a song that maybe some of you know. So the way we'll end tonight is by singing along, and with luck, we'll get the slides light. Should we take out the lights so you can't see each other? But I want, I want you to kind of put your heart and soul into this. It's pretty good. We've got the music. With luck. Yep. And you heard a snippet of this in the Pickford film too. Whoops. Okay. Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. Take it on the run, on the run, on the run. Hear them calling you and me, every son of liberty. Hurry right away, no delay, go today. Make your daddy glad to have had such a lad. Tell your sweetheart not to pine, to be proud her boys in line. Over there, over there. Send the word over there. That the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming. The drums rum-tumming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer. Send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over. And we won't come back till it's over, over there. Over there, over there. Send the word over there. That the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming. The drums rum-tumming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer. Send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over. And we won't come back till it's over, over there. They pause, and then Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. Johnny, show the Hun you're a son of a gun. Hoist the flag and let her fly. Yankee Doodle, do or die. Pack your little kit, show your grit, do your bit. Yankee to the ranks, from the towns and the tanks. Make your mother proud of you, and the old red, white, and blue. Over there, over there. Send the word over there. That the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming. The drums rum-tumming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer. Send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over. And we won't come back till it's over, over there. Okay. And that's, you can take the sound out now. But you will be humming that the rest of the day. Don't hate me. Thank you.